all right, I renamed the book, I renamed the series, and I have rewritten this chapter no less than 427,802 times. And this is the third version that I am posting online that I have meticulously gone through and created these videos for and read aloud and done the whole thing. And I don't know if this is going to be the last. I don't know why I would think that. I've rewritten this thing a zillion times. I don't know why I think this is it, but it's pretty good. It's better than it was before. Here are the things that are happening in it. 1, the gods have made a different demand of X. It's not just enough for X to bring back the information. No, they want to see Lucas with their own eyeballs, okay? So that's the first thing. They changed their demand. Secondly, X is like sick of their shit, okay? We're giving him a little bit of a rebellion earlier in the book than it was happening before. The third thing, I've totally gotten rid of the fairy scene. For our first chapter, it was a nice to have, not a need to have, so I cut it completely. And finally, we no longer also go to Lucas and Isabel's. We don't go in the house. We use that as a point of contention, and he turns around. Wait until you see what I've changed. That scene too. That's good. But you're gonna have to wait because it's gonna take me a long time to get to. Without further ado though, here is the most recent first chapter of The Weight of Names from my series, No Gods Before Us. Enjoy.
X glanced over his shoulder toward the light. Nothing stopped him from bolting up the stairs, out of the castle, over the bridge, down the foothills, onto the ferry, across Holy Lake, over the Sentinel Mountains, and back into the Forestian valleys, where wildflowers would be blooming about now. They haunted him. Come back. Nothing stopped him. He could return to the comfort of those giant redwoods, could continue his exploration of Forestian cultures. Nothing stopped him, except failing Abraham, except living the rest of his life knowing that he could have prevented the wars and the killing if he'd just completed his mission. With a sigh, X turned his chin away from the light and back toward the musty corridor in the belly of Mount Olympus. Running a pale finger along the edge of his black turtleneck, he pulled its itchy grip away from his throat. It seemed to tighten as an invisible leash dragged him toward the gods. He rapped on the door of the ironically named hearing room, although if they named it more aptly something like berating room, it'd be much harder to lure someone to it, X thought. C allowed him entry. Like X, C was a mortadel, the barren offspring of gods and Homo noscensis, Noski for short. Like X, C had learned languages to serve the gods. Unlike X, he employed those talents as the gods demanded, without question. It had taken the gods 8 decades and his father's many guilty sighs to bring X back to the Isle. Now X was back, standing before their bench on his well-worn mark. Behind the table, the godly firing squad sat, armed only with words that stung like bullets. Each god wore a predictable expression. Barton, bored. Thaddeus, stern. Ephraim, irritated, and Abraham with anticipated fatherly disappointment. Abeline's chair sat empty, as it had for the past year, without explanation. The last goddess of childbearing age, if Abeline was sick, it made X's mission all the more urgent. If she died, it would mean the end of the gods. Although no one saw them as true deities, their long life, 5 times that of the Noski, and otherworldly knowledge gave them gods-like advantage. If their eventual extinction came into sight with Abeline's death, it would mean war as the kingdoms fought and connived to secure the gods' advantages, either by peaceful inheritance from the gods themselves or, in the case of the forest, invasion. X's mission was the god's last hope. If his geneticist, Lucas, could solve mortadel infertility, they could parlay that cure into one for goddess infertility. Abraham could impregnate Abeline, and the species would be saved. But that looked less and less likely as the years and failed experiments stacked up. Well, Ephraim began with his usual charm. X reported the result of Lucas's last experiment. She died. That's it, Ephraim erupted. I want that lunatic paraded through the streets of Lowtown until his fucking feet bleed, and he admits he's a fraud. Thaddeus motioned to C, who sat behind a word processor taking meeting notes, to go off the record. Even though the gods answered to no one, such a ruthless sentiment did no good to document. He's too weak to be paraded, X replied sardonically. Abraham squinted his eyes slightly, the wordless scolding for X's tone, well-worn and quickly understood. Then we'll drag him, Ephraim replied. He wanted blood. It did not matter what body part it came from. We need a demonstration of power. The Forestians make us look like weak fools. Surely there are options between public torture and waiting, Thaddeus offered. They're your labs, your scientists. Ephraim turned his rage to Thaddeus's failure. It was rare for the gods to turn on each other in front of the help. Lucas hasn't been in my labs in months, Thaddeus said calmly. He what? Ephraim exclaimed. Thaddeus had zero reaction to Ephraim's childish rage. Using childish to describe someone almost a century old was a bit odd, but also fitting. As the last god to make it past 2 years, the older gods gave his temper more clemency than it really deserved. We have covered his illness and absence at length, Thaddeus said. Bring him here now, Ephraim commanded through clenched teeth. Here? X asked, pointing to his mark. Neogenists were not allowed in Mount Olympus's underground. Yes, Ephraim confirmed. Now! Tomorrow, Thaddeus said. X's eyes darted back and forth between the two gods as they stared at each other. Beside Ephraim, Barton yawned, demonstrating his usual boredom with anything that kept him from his next meal. Abraham, with his long beard cascading over his crimson robe, stood beside Thaddeus looking like an ancient, napping bat, as if he already knew how it all would end. Today preferred, Ephraim adjusted his demand, but tomorrow accepted. Motioning to C, Thaddeus went on record to state, X will bring Lucas to the hearing room for a progress report by midday tomorrow, the 10th day of the first month of 882. Okay, X replied. Ephraim dismissed X with a flick of his wrist. Before he turned to go, X snuck a peek at Abraham. Expected disappointment had come to fruition. X left, endeavoring to maintain a high head, but as the door closed behind him, he allowed his shoulders to sag. He shared the god's frustrations. Retreating from the god's lair, X replayed how he'd allowed himself to get here. Once a vocal defender of Forestians, someone who felt he truly understood them in ways most on the Isle didn't even care to attempt to, recent events had made advocacy much harder. Forestians had rallied behind Kirili Wilhelm's wars as he unified purposefully independent tribes under his rule. If he took the Forgotten Forest, it would be a direct violation of centuries-old treaties. Still, X hoped they would not be emboldened enough to invade the Isle of the Gods as their ancestors had attempted, with disastrous results. As if their threat of unification hadn't been enough, 3 years ago, a Forestian rumor came strutting over the Sentinel Mountains that would throw the gods, and by extension, X's life into turmoil. The claim? In the Forestian village of Istenofold, a mortadel had given birth. The gods could tolerate the formation of a giant army and the threat of war. Welcome it even sometimes. A good cleanse, Ephraim had said. But declaring a scientific breakthrough that the gods had failed to accomplish? That was unacceptable. That was dangerous. Although the gods did not believe the rumor, they couldn't afford to ignore it. If the forest had solved this, they would use it to substantiate their chosenness and rally believers to their cause beyond even the border of forest. At the time, when they first summoned X, Ephraim had said, "You're our only hope." The unsaid part was Abraham's literal silence. X's gallivanting around the forest had long been a point of contention between X and Abraham. Abraham had demanded that all his mortadels dedicate their lives to the pursuit of science, to solving mortadel infertility specifically. But X loved languages and sought to become the foremost expert in Forestian dialects. "You love the girls and the ale," Abraham had accused, somewhat accurately. Lucas's house, X gave his driver the direction. "I know," the coachman replied snidely to remind X that he didn't give the orders to Mount Olympus coachman, the gods did. As X slouched in his father's seat on his father's mission, he considered how his passion had landed him here. The Mortadel rumor had transformed X from disappointment to useful, but it wasn't enough. X thought putting the life he loved on hold and accepting the appointment would win his father's favor, would finally force Abraham to acknowledge that X's life as a translator was a worthy one. For what greater accomplishment could one achieve than saving the gods? But X wasn't saving anyone with what he'd accomplished so far. X's hundreds of Forestian interviews had uncovered only two main points. "We're chosen, na-na-na-na boo-boo," and "fuck you." "Believe it," one Forestian said. "Alexander the Great united us, and Celeste rewarded us with a miracle." "Makes you nervous, doesn't it, Mort?" another mocked. "We solved it before you and all your fancy science could. Guess your fathers ain't gods after all." But as X explained in his first report in the hearing room 3 years ago, the only remark that truly unsettled him came from a lady of Giant Meadow, who had casually said, "Oh, it's just a lark." Anyone else would have taken that statement verbatim, but X knew better. Belittling tones were the axes ladies used to chop down the Kirli's achievements, acts of covert rebellion against their conquerors. Ironically, the more they poo-pooed an impressive Kirli accomplishment, the more likely that they believed it. Between the braggart claims and jealous dismissal, X's own skepticism mostly reigned. Forestians delighted in taunting the usurpers. To start a rumor for no reason other than provocation fit the forest uprising modus operandi with capital FUs. X's skepticism changed when he arrived to Estenofold. From his first steps into the eerie village, he could tell its citizens had something worth hiding. Then, Prayer's answer, a temperamental philosophy professor who dabbled in amateur genetics, Lucas of Barak the 18th, claimed to have stumbled upon the solution while sequencing DNA strands. As a genetics hobbyist does. Despite the nagging voice in X's ear, Lucas had presented an impressive notebook detailing his process. Additionally, Lucas's enchanting sister Isabel had corroborated the evidence. X brought them to the Isle of the Gods to recreate the achievement. Yet, Lucas's experimentation had killed all test subjects, X's fellow mortadels, and cost the Isle millions in coin. Coinciding with Abeline's departure from her council seat, the gods over the past year had become more restless for a solution, more desperate. X guessed at its source. Fear. The gods were losing something they weren't accustomed to cherishing. Time. When the carriage stopped in front of Lucas's house, X got out. Looking at the small house sandwiched innocently between other South Shore homes, this mission no longer felt like an important redemption, but a curse, an impossible quest. It had stolen his freedom, snatched him from the life he loved. X balled up his fist. Why did his entire existence need to serve the gods and their perception of value? The cultures he'd experienced during his travels had taught him more than any of the gods' books or lectures. Yet, here, on the so-called Isle of the Gods, they only cared about the continuation of godly bloodlines. So myopic, so selfish, and X's only value was in his ability to communicate with those that the gods had thrown away and held down for centuries. X, shunned son of a great god, was failing. With Abraham's disappointed glare in his mind's eye, a childhood wound still raw, X turned away from Lucas's house. I'll give him a real reason to chastise me, he thought, as he walked toward the shore. Hey, the coachman yelled from his seat. Pick me up at the mount, 10 tomorrow, X called back over his shoulder. From the starboard of the ferry, X watched dapperly dressed couples promenade arm in arm along the Trader's Island shore. The classiest hotels and restaurants lined the western shore. Across the continent, their brochures boasted of impeccable views of Mount Olympus. X didn't need to turn around to look at the mountain or the castle that he'd just escaped at its top. He'd grown up riding this ferry, looking up at that castle, wondering what it would take to destroy, never dreaming of witnessing the god's extinction. Walking along the dock, merchants had filled each space with their wares. Still accepting bookings, one screamed. Ah, right, X remembered. The World Fair was just a week away. Attendees from the Isle and surrounding areas would start leaving in a few days to make the 4-day journey to Seaside. Let the rich Neogenis look forward to the fair while I toil under the pressure of this impossible task, he thought. Retreating inland, away from the polished faces and overly polite conversation, the air felt heavier with duty and strife, but far more honest. Here, in the illogically narrow alleys, the clatter of carts and rough edges of the cobblestones offered a kind of truth that hurt, in that ruthless way he deserved for shirking his responsibility. Noise, almost for noise sake, how this world hums with its grave mistake. It robs me of my best friends, they scurry to the sea. Eardrums, street drums beat heavy, boom, 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 boom. With the promise of quiet and thirst-quenching poison, X ducked into a small pub with a kitschy name. How many people knew that Notorada, translated from Arbano, meant something's fishy? The hook caught a thought, forcing a very uncharacteristic smile. Inside, the pub looked every bit a traditional Forestian pub. How had they transported or afforded the wood? An ornately carved U-shaped bar sat, crafted from Ingus redwood, its unmistakable gold specks sparkling like stars in the dim light. X took a seat along the left-hand side. A long-ago learned rule, he always faced the door. The barmaid deposited a dark ale in front of him. He prepared his violet eyes to gaze at her with gratitude, to seduce her. But she'd already left him, wordlessly, as uninterested in him as everyone else at this bar seemed to be. In most ways, he enjoyed it. He couldn't walk into a Forestian bar and be ignored. At 6 foot, 5'11", 5'10 3/4. His height and his mark of the beast, those violet eyes, mesmerized Forestian females. But here, X's invisibility allowed him to do what he loved second best to translation: observation. Mortadels mixed with Neogenis, mixed with Noski. Mouths wagged in every corner in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different languages. Here, in the swirl of tongues and clash of cultures, was the truest form of civilization, where the world's many meanings converged. It was in this noise, not in the brutal silence of power, that X felt the most at home and remembered why he became a translator in the first place. Then, a shiver crept along his neck, like the flicker of a lover's eyelashes against his skin. The air had shifted. Someone was watching, studying him, assessing, taking note of every detail. Someone watched him watching them, yet no eyes were on him. Maybe it was guilt and dread. He'd procrastinated his order, delayed his task until the last moment. Tomorrow would suck, not only because he intended to get very drunk tonight and he already anticipated his headache, but because he'd have to face not only Lucas, who always treated him like an idiot, but also his vicious sister Isabel. And when he brought Lucas to the gods, well, there was no telling if one or either of them would make it out of that basement alive. He would drink until the world blurred, until even gods seemed mortal. And when the sun rose, he'd drag a dying lie into the light.